buildings, apartment buildings that my sister lives in. It looks just like these boxes, but there's one of the women in the lower apartments turned it into a nursery. There's another woman that does catering. There's alternative economies that are in these buildings that we are blind to because we're only looking at the outside image of it. But maybe another example is a project that is here in Ramallah, Tell Safa, which really takes the model of a Palestinian village, spatially the relationships of the buildings to each other, and creates social space, public space, semi-public space, and private spaces. Exactly the way it would be in a village, and yet it doesn't function at all as it would in a village. If you go look at it, it's probably empty, like these spaces that are supposed to be places that will provide a space to build a community actually don't function because the community doesn't exist. And this probably looks at our role as architects, and maybe we give ourselves a little bit more credit in how much power we have or how much influence we have to create a community than we actually do. Here in Palestine, we look at like the need for housing, the need for affordable housing, and the building, and we see the building of all these, or at least one new planned city, Rawadi, right, and other planned neighborhoods. When if you look at the villages that are sustainable as a community and were designed this way, they collect their own water, they produce their own food. They're completely self-sufficient and were designed this way over thousands of years. They're empty. And there is houses there where people can actually live and work, and yet people are leaving them and moving to...
So is it only space or a way of life? Do we still have that way of life which we are nostalgically recalling in the city? Welcome to urban land.
But who's nostalgically calling it? The people who are interested in culture, or the people who left.
I think the intellectuals and we as architects, and there is a kind of nostalgia looking at the village. No, because they left them.
Exactly.
Because they are more frank. They left them because their way of life changed. If you are working 8, I say welcome to urban land. When you work 8 hours a day, do you still have time to go and harvest your tomatoes? Some do, but how many? What's the percentage? So I'm asking myself, is it domes and arches or a way of life? I may develop a very new structure, but really recycles its waters and can produce some urban some vegetables and herbs and things like that in a way that suits the urban life or the time budget which you have, all of you.
I think that you're incredibly individualistic way of thinking about how people live, and that perhaps in a community that would have been the model previously, someone would perform a certain role that could be 8 hours a day, what would now be like an office job, and someone else would be tending the tomatoes. And I think that a lot of the kind of what you're speaking about this new way of living, you know, it's not unique to Palestine that people have, or the communities have kind of broken up and kind of been fragmented due to, you know, various I suppose ways of living and how people are now kind of organized in urban places. But as we can kind of see from maybe some of the places that Teddy was referring to, hosts the communities that have had that and are now in the next stage of living, such as Detroit or New Orleans, where they're starting to reorganize as communities. I think there's an opportunity in Palestine to leapfrog this kind of hyper-urbanized, fragmented society, and before that happens, and you have to have, again, another iteration that will follow that to bring it back into something that is maybe more sustainable in terms of community, that you can perhaps look at devices that will facilitate some sort of marriage between those two things now that respond.
Some comments about that? And what would be those devices? I think that it's great that you began with this expanding of the issues that usually remain not mentioned because of, you know, the kind of, well, the brevity of these presentations, but what is behind? What are the mechanisms? And when you begin to completely unload, that's subordinated to, with all of these issues that we aspire to articulate, are subordinated to a huge logic, whether determined by systems of construction, cost per square foot, determined by particular, all without really altering and understanding those mechanisms. It's difficult to really get to understanding those devices. And already you mentioned, okay, one major question, what constructs the organizational logic of a Palestinian space? How can you reconstruct or enable a very different definition of community when that has been splintered? What can architects, do to engage that? And then you mentioned needs. How do we identify, translate those needs, and also mirror those, or allow those needs to resonate against the conditions of production that already exist in one scale or another. But you talked about food, you talked about agriculture, you talked about this other. So I'm thinking that those are the devices I think that would be great to further elaborate, or at least speculate very briefly. What do you think constructs the potential of that organizational space, Palestinian space? What are those social structures that you're talking about that should be enabled? Or if we're going to really talk about the specificity of economy, is there in some way or another a different procedure that can work counter to this very imposed logic of this economy of scale or economy of housing that already has been determined? That in itself would be an amazing project, really. I mean, to talk about another type of construction methodology or logic, or in terms of its economy, that can be enabled by that social composition, or what ultimately are these devices of production you talked about. I mean, a lot was talked about agriculture, not even in fact in the conference, but in my conversations, loose conversations outside, the power of that, the possibility of an agricultural-based economy mixed with housing. What can that, and that of course can be idealized and romanticized. I want to get to ideas that might be more specific.
I would like to suggest starting the discussion with the definition of community. We all architects use it, it's a very nice way, but I think we read lots of architects which talk about the community myth in urban life. So in your presentation, I find it great that you were talking about a community, but what I was reading through your expression of a community is practically NGOs, which are becoming the carrier of those interests. And it seemed to me, tell me if I'm wrong, it was practically the homeowner association. A kind of homeowner association. Although homeowner association in suburbia, per excellence, it's a very conservative group, which really keeps the homes identical because it wants to protect the value of the, but it seems a different homeowner association with people who have different needs allowed this amalgam of functions and pixelization of land uses. So what is a community in our society? Is it enough when we are Palestinians or Ramallahs to be a community? What about mobility? I have a job today in Ramallah and tomorrow I have a job in Nablus and maybe next time I'll go to the Gulf. Do I belong to those who are with me in the block? Frankly speaking, don't understand me wrong. I'm with that. I'm looking for it. But I'm asking you the questions which I also confront in my research and work. Is there really a community? Or we just call it a community? How would we define a community?
Perhaps it'd be interesting to hear maybe everybody's sort of take, or like maybe some sort of small story on how they feel community in their own surroundings.
That's what I suggest.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be great. I already have spoken too much, but just to clarify, the idea of some kind of common agreement, which goes back into the kind of reenactment of the social contract for a moment, but the device that articulates my notion of community is a developer's performance. The absorption of those invisible economies, those invisible efforts, those invisible transactions with the space and those are being brought. My provocative statement is a pro forma is a device to construct community.
Isn't it like this today? I think it was this way in villages. I mean, maybe this is my impression, but I think this is the way villages really functioned. We visit a lot of farmers. I volunteer for Sharon farmers tell us, we run a farmers market here in Ramallah, and some of the farmers tell us we don't want to sell any of our vegetables at the market because we give everything that is extra, we distribute it around to the village. So this still exists, but I think it used to exist more before. And I mean, I think occupation has a huge impact on disrupting this system. Ramallah used to function as a village because Ramallah was a village originally, and this is maybe why in the first intifada it was still functioning this way. There was still, but then out of necessity it was forced to become a city with no infrastructure of a city. And so, yes, there was a lot of problems that happened afterwards. People can't farm their lands anymore in villages. I mean, this is a universal phenomenon, I know, but it is specific to Palestine because there is a policy of getting farmers out of their land and into services because there's a land grab, right? Because if you push them out, then Israeli settlers can take over this land. And so there's, I mean, this is happening maybe in a lot of places in the world, but exponentially faster is happening here in Palestine. So this is this.
But I'm not finding real tangible forms in our conditions. It seems urbanization pushes you to individuality, and you really need to find mechanisms to recluster a kind of collective interests which make a community. How to recluster collective interests?
Complete absence of community, and in my work in the UK and in London and elsewhere, we're always searching for communities, groups of people, and it's in the same way as soon as we arrived in Palestine we started to do exactly the same thing, and we definitely found communities.
Community, but increasingly so through technology, virtual communities exist, and I can just cite one as an example, a community that I'm a member of, which is growing exponentially and has more than 2 million members worldwide, which is a community called Couchsurfing. And essentially, it's a facility where if you want to go if you're going to travel somewhere, you're going on a holiday, or for any reason you're traveling somewhere, and instead of staying in a hotel or a hostel where you would be put up with numerous other travelers that have very little in common with you, that are just going to be there as a disparate group of people visiting somewhere together with no common connections, you have the opportunity to look at, through a database of millions of profiles of people living in particular places, and see if they have particular connections with you and maybe different things that resonate between you, and then based on those connections, those potential connections, you start to form a relationship.